some of you may know my work. My name's Jakub Spacek. Oh, that was a good transition. And throughout my work, I'm focusing on design in visual effects, or we can call it the niche that I enjoy the most is abstract design with regards to simulation techniques. And so I'm excited to be here and share some of my work, and so definitely thank you, SideFX. And I want to give a big shout out to Fiona Wong, which introduced me about this project, and she was a great help throughout the process. And touch of color, let me just show you this. I haven't noticed that it's not playing. There we go. This is some of my work. And the project Touch of Color that I'll be talking about was created as a title sequence for upcoming Houdini channel, Houdini Connect. And throughout this presentation, I will guide you through the process and the whole story of how such a project essentially comes to be. My background is motion design, so it might be a less large-scale visual effects houses sort of approach. But I try to design it in a way that people that want to get into this sort of abstract design and will work with the file will be eventually available as well, will sort of have a clear understanding how to approach the principles behind working with liquids, specifically liquids in this way. So this is what it's going to be. Can we get a sound? Sorry. I'll let it play one more time if we want. Let's do one more time. Is it never enough? So I'm going to guide you through the process in Houdini, and I'll also show you some references and R&Ds within the Lookdev. So initial step for me was to put together these sort of feelers. It's essentially mood board or whatever you want references. And I was just vibing in with things that I liked. These are some of my previous R&D projects and personal projects. Some of it was from commercial R&Ds as well. And I really just started focusing on like finding the analogy of this like a connect element, merging elements and colors and sort of different techniques. And I was also thinking about maybe something larger can be created from smaller elements and how it would work as a sort of story or analogy. I love infection systems, so I was thinking, oh yeah, it would be cool to put it there somehow and play around with what it can do. One other project that I did before was some different viscosities in liquid, so I was thinking it would be nice to use this element in this project as well. And this is from a previous work, SHMelt, which I worked with my ex-colleague James Lee. And I wanted to sort of use some of the fidelity that we can get from textures onto the liquid simulation itself. And here's another reference example of multi-phase liquids where, let's say, the liquid simulation doesn't mix, but they interact with themselves and affect their own behavior. I started visiting some ideas about the material itself and how it could look, maybe some sort of candle-like wax. And I wanted to play with translucency as well, and sort of subsurface scattering. So at this stage, all of these ideas started to come together. And I also did some sketches where I just wanted to test proofs how the liquid would behave on the surface. Don't get distracted. I like drawing, but this was drawn with a mouse, so it's a little bit of a edgy sketch. Okay, so the first test that I did, initial simulation, just a few tests, was this concept proof of mixing colors on a shape. It's very basic. And I put together this storyboard to sort of test myself if the analogy and the timeline would work. So I was evolving into this shape that's being affected by these colorful particles and gradually changing the color into this sort of hero moment of this organic shape. And I always knew I wanted to link it somehow with some analogy of like Houdini branding, but obviously not too obvious. And so this idea started to happen. It would be interesting that this hero shape has some behavior that's interesting and pleasing to look at. So first thing I'm going to dive into is the surface operators that I use to create all the sources for my simulation. And here, very simply, is just a beautiful box. I give it some UVs with UV unwrap and UV layout. If you don't work with something too fancy, you don't need anything else than some custom UVs. They will be promoted to points eventually, so it will get messy at some point. So you can use, I promoted the UVs from vertices to points at the end. So the next step was to create this sort of collision object. We all know this workflow, and I knew that I want to get rid of some of the inside points to save simulation time. So this collision object is offsetted and gives me essentially collision geometry and a VDB object that I will later on use in simulation as a collider. So next thing I needed to do is to essentially make it into a liquid. So I use a flip source to turn it into particles, and then I'm using the collision object to sort of kill the inside points of the simulation. And this is sometimes, it seems simple, but I've seen many times people don't do these, let's say, tweaks to save simulation times, because at this resolution it may not make sense, but when you go high res, all those points inside can be tens of millions of points that would be simulating for no reason. So it's a little bit of optimization that you want to do. And I give it some custom attributes. I knew I want to use this principle of multi-phase liquid. So I have a density, viscosity, and temperature, which will vary from the eventual sources that will be falling onto this object. And I have some custom attributes as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. So then the next step was to take the UVs from the box and transfer it onto my points. So I'm using UV transfer. It's very simple. And I'm just taking point attribute and transferring into another point object. Sorry. So here we have this custom edge attribute. And the reason why I created it is, let's say if you have a UV texture on a geometry, even if you have the most perfect seams, the moment you promote it onto point cloud, or let's say point source like this, you will end up with seams that will look ugly in your final render, especially if you use textures for displacement and stuff like that. So I wanted to create this mask that would give me control over the areas where the UVs can, let's say, glitch or behave in a way that would be not nice to essentially look at. So I took the box, converted into splines, and I just transferred this edge attribute onto the points and gave me this beautiful mask. And the next step, let's say the main driving force for those droplets that will be falling onto this box shape, needed to be versatile and animated and have all the properties for some interesting motion that I wanted to get out of the simulation. So this is essentially noise velocity, but it's aligned to a surface. And we have a volume node that gives me the resolution and sampling, and VDB that gives me the sign distance field information that essentially put the noise in a respectful distance from the object. And here you can see the setup, how it works in volume warp. So we can see that the curl noise is feeding in the sign distance field from the VDB. And eventually I'm just exporting it as a velocity vector attribute. And yeah, this is the result of the velocity field that makes everything move. And next additional field that I created was this sort of attraction force. There's many ways in Houdini how you can create things, and I implemented it into the setup so that you can sort of see a different approach how to create a velocity field. So you can just rasterize your point cloud with attributes into a volume field. Essentially, in dynamics, you could create some simple pop attract and drive your particles with that, but this gives you sort of another layer of control, especially if you're going to be mixing two different velocity fields. And finally, the droplets. So it's very simple. I just have a sphere, fill it with points, and because it's sphere, I can use polar projection in my UV project node, and then I'm scattering it around the box. And what I'm doing here is just I'm taking a scatter on a larger box and using a simple expression, very handy expression, I use it all the time, which will give me a random momentum where this point will appear. And with global seed, I'm offsetting where it's appearing in space. So I can change and iterate many different simulations with different results very easily. And again, I have these custom attributes, and you can notice density is lower and the original shape has a higher density. So when the droplets fall, the liquid mixes, it doesn't mix too much, it mixes just a little bit enough. And you can play with these values depending on the resolution of your simulation or properties that you have as well. And viscosity is also lower, but the temperature here is very high, and that's what will be driving this sort of melting, waxy feeling. So one lesson that I want to leave you with here is cache your sources. And the reason for it is that if you have, for example, the velocity field right here, or the sourcing points, depending on your resolution of the simulation, it can get slow to read these sources into your simulation, and eventually you'll end up with slowing down the whole process. So look at your sources, check which are best, essentially playing slowly, and cache them up front. And here is an initial animatic from the very, very first simulation I was doing. At that time, I was just dropping it into After Effects and stretching it down and slowing it down as I needed. And this is the thing with simulations like this. If you start with some low resolution, you might find moments that you like and think, oh, this is the angle that you want to keep. But as you will ramp up your resolution, you'll end up with completely different looks, behavior, and shape. So you need to think about it. Everything will change, even the speed of the simulation as you will progress. And I'm just going to show you a few little Lookdevs that I was doing at this stage. So we can see that at this moment, the simulation has these like arrows, it's shooting out, the velocity was very sharp on the corners of the box, and I knew there's still a lot of stuff I needed to smooth out. So I was playing with the values that I need for the final velocity. And here it's sort of more composed. I was getting good results, and it was test proving that this overall idea is working. And with high resolution, I was getting even some nice moments within the simulation. The textures were working on it as well. And I'll talk about it a bit more later on. And obviously, I took a camera and started chasing around some interesting shots. And this is really, for me, if you're someone who works with simulations, rendering, lighting, even if it's a task that you have to do for a client, I feel that's like a reward that I can essentially procrastinate with and just relax and just play around with the material. So it was very nice to just see that the concept that I had in mind is coming together. I played around with the material. The displacement was working as well. And it was just about ramping up the resolution and behavior. I was looking at some macros. I do a lot of just IPR screenshots just to have loads of images I can take a look back at. And I introduced some neutral background, so the colors would be always the main sort of story in this animation. And at this stage, I knew that everything's working. So let's look at the dynamic. So it's dynamic operators and flip simulation. As probably most of you know, it's fluid and particle simulation. So we are working with points as well as voxel information that drives the behavior and interaction of those points. So this is like a just basic setup, and we bring everything together. We have the flip solver collider and sourcing this initial shape. And obviously you enable stuff like aging particles, ID attributes, so you can do a lot of things in post with it. But the main one I want to talk about is apply particle separation. It's a very handy function to have enabled. It will give you much better behavior of the particles and also the distribution of them, and all the attributes that they carry will be evenly distributed. The downside is that it's going to take longer to simulate, and at some cases you will end up with problems like this, where those points are constantly trying to find the ideal separation and end up with something weirdly looking. So I needed to find a hack the go around is because I didn't want this hero shape to have any deformation unless I drop those hot droplets on it. So I dive into a subsolver, and all of these droplets were carrying these mask attributes, right? So I was just transferring the attribute onto the simulation to give me this gradually spreading mask. And then back on the dynamic level, I created a lerp function that was essentially blending the initial position of the points with the, let's say, position that had the applied particle separation within it. And you can see it works. So the box doesn't start shrinking unless those droplets are involved. And at this stage, I knew it works. You know, the shape, motion, velocity that you can see there is driving the droplets. Everything is mixing as it should. However, especially the color is not mixing between the liquids and the other attributes as well. And because I know I want to work with UVs, I want to be mixing everything together. So another step that I wanted to do is achieve this mixing without mixing the white coming from the hero shape onto the points. So all I did is kept the droplets. I mixed the color and attributes like UVs or like IDs or whatever between themselves, and then affected the hero shape at the end. So if I wouldn't do this step, everything would start mixing and end up with some like a gray looking sort of moldy object. So I needed to sort of tweak this bit a little bit. And then I created this timer, which is incoming time attribute. At a certain time, I just said, hey there, start cooling down or sort of decreasing its value. And that sort of gave me the ability to drive the velocity of that shape in a procedural way. So every droplet that's coming in, I'm just saying, as you age, just speed up with your velocity. You can't go higher than velocity 10, and after certain time that I can change, it can be 1 second or 3 seconds, you can have it anywhere in your controls in your scene. I essentially hardwire an order to start slowing down. And whatever you would change in your setup, it would always respect these rules. So it was good for me as I was doing different iterations and moments in different simulations. And now the most important bit that drives this whole, let's say, unique motions. So it's obviously the temperature and gas temperature update. It's a great tool. It was introduced somewhere around Houdini 15, if I'm not mistaken. And it gives you the ability to just skip the whole process of melting and doing these things in subsolver. So it takes the incoming temperature value from whatever you're feeding it in, and it has its presets of you know, how the radius of the effect. You can map the temperature to viscosity, so all these things can be used, but you can still have your own attribute for melting, and this sort of gives you much cleaner and elegant solution for this approach. So here you can use you can see the whole setup. And the last thing was this cooler. So even though gas temperature update has its own sort of cooling mechanism, I wanted that at certain moment the whole simulation would just stop and sort of solidify. And this is this sort of cooler Vex function. So here another little lesson that I'm going to give you. Start with the slice. And what I mean by it, don't start simulating your whole simulation until you test proof that all of your steps and things that you want to happen in your simulation work on a slice, and you can save enormous amount of time with this. So here what I did, I adjusted the collision object so the points are not escaping somewhere when I run the simulation. And also within your dynamics, you can scale down the bounding box of your, let's say, voxels within the flip solver. So you'll end up with much faster simulating process, and you can do a lot of iterations in shorter time. And I've seen a lot of people in studios on projects that would like hand me over or show me that they're working on something, and I would try to convince them that they can just scale it down to a little slice until they're sure that it's going to look good. So that's another one. So, and then the last step for this was post-processing. So I take all the simulation, bring it into another geometry node, and essentially the most important part with liquids, let's say, is fluid compress. Obviously, liquids can get very heavy, and here we can see this was some frame 300 within the simulation. I had 22 million points, and fluid compress can make a massive difference with the size of the cache that you have on your hard drive. So it's almost a half, essentially. However, it's a sort of packed geometry, essentially. So you need to tell it which attributes you want to keep and link your particle separation to your liquid simulation resolution. And the last step that I wanted to do is I was doing very heavy simulation, and now we're talking about single workstation, 128 gigabytes of memory and some sort of Threadripper. It's not like a pipeline with distributed simming in a big VFX house. So you want to simulate as least as you can. And I knew that I want a nice slow animation. So I simulated, let's say, 500 frames of a simulation. And then I used retime to sort of slow it all down. And you can even subdivide the interpolation of all the attributes with retime. So that was super handy. And here you can see I'm using unpack to sort of open up the fluid compress cache, and then I'm using retime, and then I do just surface cache. And surface cache, there's no sort of set recipe for what are the best values. You always want to sort of test what you need for your own project. And the last step was to promote the normals to points so I can blur them and give the liquid the sort of final touch. And here we can see the final result of the simulation. Everything is slowed down. There's no, I don't know, weird glitches or problems that I would have. And I knew that like everything is inside. So one little note again, sorry for teaching you all the time, essentials only. And what I mean by that is just keep in your final cache that will be saved on your hard drives only the necessary attributes that you have. And again, I've seen before, even like smoke simulations that people would be storing velocities, or it would be even in a format of .sim, and it would have like terabytes of space on a hard drive. So keep what you really need. And here, aside from color and ID, which is like the obvious must, I had the edge attribute, age, vorticity, you can see temperature, and essentially the shape drops and the UV. And I knew I can start playing around again with some fancy rendering. And this is the animatic that was coming out at this stage. I still wasn't happy about few angles, few cameras, and I was looking for more sort of final and composed rhythm. So Lookdev, make it shine. I always think it's good to use as many things that the simulation is offering to you. So I started by just testing, if all the materials and displacement are working on my liquid simulation. So it doesn't necessarily look like that it's a liquid or something that would be liquefied. You can give it like a lot of interesting properties by using textures and displacement and similar. And I really started just, looking for the right values for the material and the shading. And overall, I wanted to, the idea was that it needs to be like positive, inviting, sort of neutral, yet sort of juicy and creative. And I started implementing this idea of sort of this heat map emanating temperature from below the surface. So again, I had all those attributes I could drive it with, like vorticity or temperature or even age. So all those came together and gave me really handy setup for doing something that's like nice and pleasing to look at. And again, what's beautiful with simulations, you don't need to follow with abstract simulations, you don't need to follow any rules of a real world. You can just put in whatever you find interesting. And at this stage, I was still experimenting with the infection setup. You saw at the beginning, I had this as a R&D. So I wanted this sort of orange wave spill over the whole shape eventually, but it would be too orange, what do you say? So gradually, I was just toning it down a little bit and started visiting some color themes and sort of combination of shades that would work together. And Now I'm just going to show you shot by shot how it sort of evolved into the final stage. So this shot was bothering me for a long time, so I started implementing different camera angles, and then I noticed in some angles you will be seeing these droplets being spawned, so you just have to delete them. And eventually everything came together fine. I really was happy with this angle, and all of the animation I was trying to combine it and connect it with this sense of rotation. So all the shots had this sort of connectivity with the next shot and the next shot. And here are some of the previous iterations of the first shot. And the next one, this was really fun to play with. In this stage, I started to playing around with the idea, started mixing in some metal materials, and again, something that we wouldn't normally see happening. So it was a lot of fun to just search for the right sort of colors and materials and values. And I had really, what I usually have as an issue is like finding the stop and deciding what will be the one that I like the most, or what should it look like. So yeah, and this was the final sort of look. And here are some of the previous iteration. And sometimes using everything isn't always the best, so the heat map didn't really work for me here, and I was thinking it can evolve over the course of animation. And shot 3, I really like this one because we can see 3 planes of the box and each motion is different, so there was a lot of experimenting with this. And Redshift, that's something I didn't mention. It's all rendered in Redshift, and it gave me a lot of good tools to play around and split the colors and sort of have a lot of control over the shader. And here we can see some, again, previous version of the shot. So I was playing around with the metallic moments and how it sort of emits the emission of the temperature. And in shot 4, I had this little break and started to experiment with different color theme, and eventually I sort of stick with my chewing gum mix, and gradually again started to implement the metallic shader and this sort of heat map, and comparing how these elements would work together in the extreme moments. So it's a lot of sort of fun when everything works and you have your simulation done to just play around with the final stuff. And here you can see with and without the sort of metallic shader. And the last, next shot, everything was working sort of out of the box. So I was just looking for the right angle to sort of complement the animation, so it would sort of finish into the next shot in the right way. And this was the final moment with and without the metallic material. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the sound design, and it was done in collaboration with Jonas Stegenfeld. He's a Swedish composer, and we had a lot of fun with developing the sound design. Definitely check out his page. And I put together just a few moments, like I want to, be able to hear what's happening in the simulation, even though maybe in the real world we wouldn't necessarily hear how melting wax, sounds like. So it's about finding a balance of a sound that will be relatable for the simulation, as opposed to just doing something that wouldn't sound right. And Jonas started testing some of his initial ideas, and we started with some basic sound. Yes. So Jonas went for this sort of ambient music and surroundings, and I was always pushing the idea of hearing the individual droplets and elements. So he worked on it a little bit more and started layering and adding more sort of sounds on top of it. But even though it may seem enough, I still wasn't happy, and I was like, let's try some really specific sounds that will sort of work with the motions where something goes over the edge or something speeds up or slows down. So I ended up sending him a loads of ASMR references from YouTube, which can be like 3-hour video of someone whispering into a microphone. It's ridiculous what you can find. So here's some of the funny examples.
Fries and glitter in it.
And it's surprising what you can find. But that being said, there is a lot of interesting references. And Jonas ended up recording some of his sound effects at home. So I'm going to play the final one more time, and you can just listen if there's something similar. And there we go. So the last notion I want to keep you with, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And the reason for it is that in Houdini in general, I found overly complicated setups sometimes when I look at people's files. And it's about like looking for the most elegant solution, because if it's not elegant and it doesn't feel right, it's not the best one. And I know usually it all comes down to how much time do you have on a project. So yeah, it's good to think about these things with how you organize your scene, how you sort of plan for the project, and yeah, keep it simple. So thank you so much. Sorry for all the technical problems. I hope you enjoyed it, and yeah, thank you.
Amazing work and presentation, Jakub.
Thank you.
Really awesome. In case any of you don't know what a Houdini Connect is, it's about a 4 or 5 minute video, like a project profile on some work that's been done with Houdini by artists in the community. And so this is the intro to our Houdini Connects now. It replaced some work that was done by Simon Holmedal a few years ago. We used that for many years because it was amazing, and it took us a long time to replace it with something equally good, but Jakub did a great job with that. The concept of Houdini Connects is to showcase what the artists are doing, and as a series, the interplay between side effects and the software and the artists and the projects and their clients or their work, blending together is really nicely represented by that work. So nicely
Thanks.
done. Yeah. Questions? Yeah.
Anything?
Hi, great talk.
Thank you.
Really beautiful stuff. I have a question about the strain marks you are leaving with as all the fluid is moving. These are very detailed, and I would like to know if everything is driven by the dragged UVs, or are you doing something with the curvature in the shader? So as the sort of the droplet drags by the velocity, it distorts the UVs, right? And then when you apply texture to it, it will respect this distortion as well. So even if you could render this as a stone at the beginning, and the stone would start melting. So this would be something interesting for people to pick up the file, play around with it, and yeah, if you do that, let me know, and I'll be happy to share sure.
it.
No, that's awesome.
Yeah,
thank you.
It's very handy to do on new liquids.
Other questions?
Yeah. Hello. Awesome stuff, as already said. In the beginning, you mentioned multi-phase fluids. I recognize that you can do this with vellum fluids, but is there also a way to do that with flip?
Not by checking some sort of parameter on the solver, but this is more about the physical aspect of just using the right values for your densities and viscosities, so the liquids wouldn't mix completely together. Yeah, so lower density will obviously stay above, so you can think of it in this ways. It's physically multi-phase, but not in terms of like the solver.
So you just prevent the merging by the physical attributes?
Yes, so there's a force constantly pushing everything together, but they never mix completely.
Okay, thanks.
Another one.
Yeah, yeah.
Why do you wake up the particles at the very beginning when instead of using the viscosity, which is another way of doing it? Why have you choose to attacking the velocity directly?
Now you mean when they'll sort of spawn to sort of speed up? That was just sort of give them this sort of punch or impact, so they would maybe connect more, aggressively into the material.
Yeah, but I mean the particles from the cube itself.
Yeah.
They are a stop. All the particles at the very beginning. You make it stop using its velocity.
I see what you mean.
Not the viscosity. You can do a very hard viscosity cube and then lower down the viscosity until it gets fluid. But you haven't done it in that way. I would like to know why.
Well, that's the thing. If you use apply particle separation, what you saw in that example with the shrinking down, that's what was happening still even with viscosity million without any forces. So that is sort of unfortunate result of sort of static simulation having this apply particle separation. And initially, exactly, I was thinking, yeah, I'll just keep adding viscosity and it's going to stop, but it didn't.
Okay,
yeah.
that answered my question perfectly. Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, great work.
Thank you.
Can you maybe explain a bit more how you kind of got rid of the UV seams with the mask attribute?
That's a good point. So essentially, at the very end, I just took the mask, and in Redshift I used displacement blender, and I essentially said in the area of the edge attribute, I want the displacement to be, let's say, 0.001, let's say. So you can sort of give it, you could even disable it completely, but this way you can control where it's going to be happening or not. And without this mask attributes, at the edges of the box, it would be sort of like a, wrinkly UV and displacement. So you don't want that. Unfortunately, that's what will happen always, because if you transfer UVs from a geometry on a point, there will be a seam somewhere at some point.
So you basically just toned down the displacement in the masked area.
It's like a little cheat, essentially.
Okay, great, thanks.
Any others? Well, thank you very much, Jakub.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks, guys.